Good afternoon. I'm joined now from Calgary by Mark Milke. He's the Alberta director of the Fraser Institute, and he's also the author of a study on human rights in oil-producing countries. But he's just written a column for Troy Media that's not about human rights in other countries. It's about human rights in Canada and a Saudi attempt to silence free speech. And in your column, you compare the reaction of a major network to the way media used to handle the Soviet Union. What is the issue that's got you so exercised?
Well, when CTV's lawyers and executives decided not to allow an ad from ethicaloil.org to air on their network, that was more than a little unfortunate, right? It flies in the face of traditions in Canada that go back to our founding and before. It goes back to our historical influences, both on the English side, right? Think back to the Magna Carta in England. Think back to the French Revolution and the cry for liberty. I mean, the attempt by Saudi Arabia to interfere in Canada's affairs is, I think, without precedent, and also unfortunate. It's unfortunate that CTV's lawyers and executives agreed to this, and I imagine their journalists take a very different view.
Well, some of them do and some of them don't. We actually have a clip here from a discussion that CTV had about their own decision that is, to me, absolutely astonishing.
Are we really more ethical than countries like Saudi Arabia? And I put this to you because for years...
Are we really better than countries like Saudi Arabia? How do journalists ask questions like this? I mean, what do you need to know about Saudi Arabia in order to answer that question without hesitation?
Back to the Soviet Union, this reminds me of the phrase useful idiots that Lenin used to bring up vis-a-vis the West that would hang itself. I can't conceive of where they came up with that sort of notion that we're at all comparable to Saudi Arabia. Look, in defense of some things in Saudi Arabia, the rate of literacy for women is high. Educational attainment is high. There are plans to open up the workforce to more women. I mean, that's a relative improvement on a bad record, though. And you know, if you look at any indicators of freedom in Saudi Arabia, religious freedom, civil freedom, political freedom, certainly press freedom, there is no comparison between the two countries. I can only imagine that some journalists might think in some case that our oil is as bad as Saudi Arabia's oil. I mean, the entire sort of notion of that, though, as well, is kind of preposterous. As I didn't hear that entire interview, I can only speculate as to where they were going on that particular question. Yeah. But you cannot compare the two countries on any level, and it's sort of shameful and ridiculous that anyone would try.
Yeah, I think it's so odd. I mean, it seems to me the fact that in Saudi Arabia they execute people for being homosexual ought to get the attention of liberal journalists in the West. I mean, do you need more than that? Because we've got more. But I would have thought that would be enough by itself. Now, the issue that ties in here, because the ads were about where we're going to get our oil. Here's a chart, which is from your study, about the countries that produce oil and those that are free and those that are not free. And the essential argument of the ethical oil ads is as long as we're going to use oil, why would we give money to regimes that repress their own people and in many cases, including the Saudis, spread trouble in the world, instead of to countries where the rule of law exists, women and gays have rights, and we follow the rule of law? Why on earth would we, you go down that list and say, where do I want to buy my oil? Whose answer would be Saudi Arabia?
Right, and I think the core problem here is people think they can have it both ways. They think they can have a perfectly clean planet and they can have their goodies, and they don't have to make a choice between Saudi Arabian and Canadian oil. Well, look, world demand is there. It's going to continue to increase, we know, from East Asian demand over the next couple of decades. That's the reality, like it or not. Now, where you get your oil from after that, would you rather have it shipped into the northern United States via a pipeline, or would you have it rather drilled in Saudi Arabia, put in tankers, and shipped over to the United States? That's the question, for example, for U.S. policymakers. And it does matter where they get their oil from. Would they prefer to support jobs in Canada and North America, in the United States as well, on these sorts of things? Would they care to support a country whose human rights record is exemplary, ours? Or would they care to see cash go to Riyadh? And we know where some of that money ends up. Again, look, I hope Saudi Arabia reforms one day, and there are quasi-reformers within the kingdom. We know that. We know there are attempts. But in the meantime, any attempt to interfere in our internal affairs is rather surprising. You'd think they'd have a bit better sort of grasp of PR than that. In addition, I mean, let's talk about the law firm in Canada, Norton Rose, that sent the letter to media outlets and to the Canadian Telecommunications division. I mean, let's talk about Norton Rose's law firm. They have a diversity policy which explicitly talks about the good aspects of diversity, right? That we want people to be welcome of all faiths, of all nationalities, all genders, all orientation. All of that is good and well. And then the law firm decides to take a client and send a letter threatening media in Canada. I mean, it doesn't exactly compute, and I imagine there's a few lawyers within inside that firm that didn't agree with that decision, just as there's a few journalists within CTV that look askance at sort of the lawyering over of the Saudi Arabian human rights record.
Yeah, I would think there are probably some lively discussions within their halls, and I hope some sensible ones. We have one more clip from CTV, though, that indicates what happens when a discussion is not sensible, also from the same panel discussion that we were just watching.
Of course we're not as guilty of human rights abuses on a systematic level as they are. But let me...
Okay, so you admit it. Thank you. But the point is, and that was Scott Reed, former Liberal Communications Director, that he was doing a kind of bait and switch. He wasn't willing to talk about where we should get our oil. When that question came up, he said, well, we shouldn't use oil, basically, before admitting he drove an SUV. You know, there's two separate questions. Can we replace oil? And if we can't replace oil, where are we going to get it? You have to think these things systematically. And I also once talked to Marcel Coutu, who's the head of the oil sands, and he said, you know, our oil is only very slightly worse in terms of greenhouse gas than the average barrel that the Americans are consuming. It's not a big difference. And moreover, he said, we think we've got 1.7 trillion barrels. So we really developed that resource. We can put OPEC and we can put the Saudis out of the subversion business completely. If we're going to buy oil, surely clean oil is the answer.
Right. I mean, it's not an easy thing. You can't sort of turn on or turn off a switch overnight. But over time, you can lessen the influences of nations that have questionable human rights records. Look, I mean, if Europe, for example, didn't have to take Russian gas and Russian oil or Middle Eastern oil and Middle Eastern gas, they might be willing to, say, challenge the Russian autocracy on certain points, which they're not willing to now. That's what thinking long-term allows you to do. It allows you to make sure you're not captive to one supplier, right?
Yeah.
And so the more that the United States can get off Middle Eastern oil, the better it is for them. Obviously, it's better for us. On the environmental questions, I'll happily let the scientists debate that. There's all sorts of opinions all over the map on that one, and that's fine.
Okay,
but I mean, in general,
we do have to go now. I want to thank you very much for being with us and for sharing with us some thoughts from your study on oil and political freedom. I do care where I get my oil, and so should everybody else. Mark Milke, Alberta Director of the Fraser Institute, thank you for being with us.